Well, good evening, everybody. It's lovely to have you at the university. We have many guests with us this evening. The High Sheriff and his wife. Always nice to have you with us. We have well-wishers and friends from several quarters, academics from universities around us, social workers that work with Professor Lavalette, friends and supporters of the university, Bishop Vincent, Professor Macon, and many others here. These inaugural lectures are important not just for the university but also for our colleagues, because it's where we stop to listen to what our new professors actually profess. And it's a good convention at universities for there to be a wide range of people, not just from social work or sociology, but from the entire university. So it is an important moment in the life of a faculty to inaugurate its professors. Together we also have with us the leader of the Preston City Council. You're very welcome. And equally important, perhaps more important, are family members of our professors, because it's not just a university celebration. It's also a celebration for families represented here. Professor Lavalette's partner, of course, is a member of the university community, but I'm especially delighted to have his father with us today, which is you're very welcome, sir. And the younger daughter. I know one of the daughters is busy studying for exams, but at least one of the daughters with us. You're very welcome. The Department of Social Work is one of our newer departments at the university. It was started by Dr. and Mrs. Bates. Dr. Bates joined us and began the department some 7 years ago. And even though he's retired, he handed over to one of his colleagues that he appointed, who came to us from the University of Liverpool and came to us as associate professor, Professor Michael Lavalette. Of course, in these short years, this department has done more than some of our departments that have been here for 25 years, simply through its sheer dynamism, its visionary leadership, and the kind of distinctiveness this department has, which touches at the mission and values deeply of this university. You'll notice it's called the Department of Social Work, Social Work, Care and Justice. And it captures very clearly, I think, the university's commitment for social justice. And I'm delighted that Professor Michael Lavalette and his team have wanted that dimension in its name. It's quite unusual for a Department of Social Work in England or in Britain to actually want to institutionalize that concern in its name. So we have an extraordinary department that's progressed faster than most. We're very proud of it. It's done well in the first submission in the research exercise a few years ago, and I suspect it's going to do even better this time. And so we gather then to celebrate the establishment of the Foundation Professor of Social Work, Professor Michael Lavalette. And to introduce him, I'm going to ask Pro Vice Chancellor Professor Newport to speak, please.
Well, it's a very great pleasure indeed, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity, as I always am on these occasions, to introduce our new professor and hence our inaugural lecturer this evening, Professor Michael Lavalette. Professor Lavalette is the most recent addition to Hope's Professoriate, a body of distinguished academics that the university has spent a great deal of time and indeed a great deal of money building up over the past several years. Hope is somewhat unusual in making it a stipulation of all professorial appointments who are appointed on the basis of their academic excellence and international level research. They must also be engaged in and teach across the curriculum, right from the first year through to doctoral supervision. And that encapsulates our belief, which we translate into practice, that research in and of itself is of limited value. It is the way in which that research informs teaching and practice that really brings that activity to life. And here at Hope, we pride ourselves in a curriculum that is, as we say, research-informed and also researcher delivered. Professor Lavalette was born and brought up in Ayrshire in Scotland. At the age of 17, he left home and went to Glasgow University, where he obtained a first-class degree in sociology. He then undertook a postgraduate diploma in guidance and therapy and worked thereafter for 2 years in Aberdeen before returning to the University of Paisley, now the University of the West of Scotland, to undertake a PhD, which was a sociological or social historical study of child labour. Being a true product of the Enlightenment traditions of Scottish education, Professor Lavalette has published widely on a range of other topics, including those in which he did his research for his PhD, from the implementation of the poll tax in Scotland and the mass protest movements to which that gave rise, to the social consequences of the Liverpool Docks lockout from 1996 to 1998. Professor Lavalette has also worked and published on the crisis that occurred in social work following the Baby Peter scandal, which I'm sure we all remember, and on aspects of social work under conditions of war, such as in Lebanon. In addition to his journal publications, Professor Lavalette has edited and published a very wide range of books, and I really do mean a very wide range indeed, from both academic and mainstream publishers. And by the middle of this year, he will have 25 books with his name on the cover, and those books cover such diverse topics as child labour, theories and concepts in social policy, leadership in social movements, international social work in extreme conditions, for example, in the face of war or natural disasters, anti-racism, adult social care, capitalism and sport, and young people in Palestine. Professor Lavalette is well known as a passionate speaker in defence of his subject, and this has led to innumerable invitations to address national social work organisations, both academic and practitioner-focused, in Britain and Spain, Brazil, Canada, Japan, Hong Kong, Germany, and I could go on for a very long time. He is the joint editor of the new International Journal of Critical and Radical Social Work, which will be launched later this month and is based here at our university, and we're delighted to have been able to offer support to get that off the ground. And he wants me to point out in particular there's a flyer for that journal, I believe, and an invitation to take the first 2 issues for free, available after this inaugural lecture. Well, Professor Lavalette is certainly a very busy man, and if that weren't enough, what I've already reeled off, he's also a local councillor in Preston. Finally, Professor Lavalette's links in Palestine have allowed our students to undertake field trip work in the Palestinian West Bank. And these trips are life-changing for the students, but they are also an important symbol of Michael's commitment, and indeed Hope's commitment, to the bringing together of theory and practice, and the necessity to link academic research to the problems of the real world as part of his vision of what a politically engaged public intellectual should do. And so, as I say, it's a very great and genuine delight and joy this evening to be able to invite Professor Michael Lavalette to deliver to us his inaugural lecture, which is entitled, What is Social Work? Professor Lavalette.
Vice-Chancellor, members of Senate, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, Dad, Saskia, Laura. It really is a great honour to be asked to deliver this lecture at Liverpool Hope University. As the Vice-Chancellor said, I came from Liverpool University 4 years ago, and at the time some people thought this was a risk. I was going from a very large department of sociology at Liverpool University to a social work section which involved John and Vasilis at the day I was appointed. So I went from a large university department to one that was 2 but growing. But what was on offer really was the chance to work to develop a social work programme that reflected the university's mission and its commitment to social justice, with a vision of a social work programme and research that was also committed to social justice. And it has also created the space for me to think about some of the things that I want to talk about today. and I want to talk about what is social work. And that might seem like a strange title. You could almost think, well, if the professor of social work doesn't know what social work is, there's clearly something gone wrong. But actually, thinking about what social work is not as straightforward as you may consider or may think. I don't expect you to read this, but behind me are some of the themes of the International Federation of Social Work's definition of what social work is. It's up for debate this year, and there are maybe some changes, but at the moment this is a very important definition, and it makes reference to social work being a profession which is committed to social justice. It makes reference to social work being a profession which is committed to counteracting and fighting inequality and oppression wherever it sees it. It talks about a very strong value base. It talks about the need for reform in societies to improve people's lives. And it makes various statements which I wholeheartedly agree with. But if you're a social worker and you happen to be working in social work in Britain today, probably doesn't really have much connection with what your working life is like. I'm going to try and work out how you... So we have a definition, an international definition, which makes some grandiose claims, very positive claims, claims that I would support. But actually, if you're working in a children and families team in a statutory social work setting in Britain, actually the government suggests you should have 20 cases. You probably will have closer to 60. Your work will be dominated by a computer system and form filling, within which one of the complaints social work practitioners make is that they don't have time to meet people and to build relationships with clients or service users. For those of us who aren't social workers, you might think that building relationships with service users was central to what social work is about, and yet in government agencies, time pressures, domination by computers, form filling, target setting, these things mitigate against people's ability to form those human relationships with service users and try to address their needs. So the first thing I just want to at least raise is that there seems to be a disjuncture between the international, the broad claims of what social work is about and the reality of what we do in practice. There's a second theme, and these things start to get more complicated as we go round. The second thing is that social work can vary quite dramatically depending on the location where you work. The vast majority of social workers will work in statutory settings or will work doing statutory work. That's the ones that's time pressured, that's the ones where there's a form filling, etc. But there are also people who will work with refugees, with domestic violence projects and community projects, and are allowed to develop very creative ways of dealing with human problems. But they're a minority, and they're also under huge pressure, especially at present, from austerity and from funding cuts. There's a third issue. The third issue is how social work has been regulated, or how it is regulated, and how those regulations have changed what is defined as social work. Now, that might seem a bit strange, but if I can give you some examples from some of the people that are in the room today. My dad was a social worker. He trained before I was born, so I'm not quite sure the exact date, but in the early 1960s. But he trained as a probation officer in Scotland. There were no social work departments in Scotland at the time until after the Kilbrandon Report of 1966, at which point child protection workers, adult workers and probation workers came together within social work departments. So his training was in probation, but he became a social worker and then an area manager social worker and was a social worker by title and by job for the rest of his working career. In the late 1970s, people trained by undertaking a CQSW, a Certificate in Qualified Social Work. That was an interesting qualification. It was either a 1-year or a 2-year qualification, and it was a qualification for social workers and for community workers. So in the same course, there would be community workers and social workers. Social workers would do community placements, community workers could do social work placements, and the two of them were seen to be two sides of the same coin. They would then go into practice in generic social work teams, where community workers, probation workers and social workers would all be part of the same mix of dealing with the complex problems of people in communities. The CQSW was then removed and replaced by the Diploma in Social Work. One of the consequences of the Diploma in Social Work was to narrow the definition of what social work was and the conditions of regulation. Since then, we've then gone through the degree in social work, and again, what we've seen is with the degree in social work is in most places there is very little emphasis on community social work, very little emphasis on group social work, and social work being self-defined as an activity which only works with individuals who find themselves in points of crisis or in points of trauma. There are still some people who don't practice in this way. Mandy, who's here from the Foxton Centre in Preston, for example, they run a community-based project which focuses on community cafes and trying to engage people from the community in their centre, because they understand that to deal with the problems of isolation and trauma, you have to bring people out of the isolation of the home and work with them in those community settings. But those programmes and those projects are rare around social work today. Then there's a fourth problem. The International Federation of Social Work definition applies to social work internationally. But as we move from country to country, what we define as social work changes in subtle and not so subtle ways. So let me give you some examples. In India, in our degree course, our social work students can go to Stella Maris or Madras Christian College and undertake a placement either at BA or an MA level at one of our sister colleges in Chennai. They will work with students from those universities who do a BA in social work or an MSW in social work. The social work programmes that those Indian students will undertake are very similar. In 90% of the cases, they are very similar to what social work is like at universities here. Indian social work students, in their final year, will make one of 4 options for specialism. They will do hospital social work, which some of our social work students would do here, so that's a similarity. They will do children and family social work, which most people in Britain would assume is the majority of what social workers do. Then there's the most popular type of social work for women in India, that's community social work, which reflects Gandhian principles of involves people living in the community, dressing like the people in the slums and working to address their problems. The most popular type and the most popular option for women. And then there's the most popular option that's undertaken by male social workers in Indian universities, human resource management. Now, human resource management is not anything like any social work student at any British university would want to do. And yet those male social work students in India undertake social work with a human resource specialism because they want to get a job in one of the global multinationals that now work in India and are well paid, and that's what they will do, no social work at all. So there's India. In Brazil, I was in Brazil last year and I was talking about some of the problems that social workers have in the workplace. The large caseloads, the child protection work that they do. And at the end of that conference, the Brazilian social workers took me aside and said there was a problem with what I was talking about. What I was talking about was not social work, which will come as a shock to many of the social workers in here, because this is absolutely what we consider social work to be. They considered what we called social work, social services work. For them, social work was community-based campaigning work which took place in the favela and the poor barrios around the cities of Brazil. That was social work for them. What we did primarily was social services work. So you can see that although we all claim to be social workers, when we roll the definitions out internationally, we have even greater problems about understanding what we think social work is about. Then there's some further problems. And these further problems, I think, are drawn with a number of examples from practice. The first one I've got down here is of community cafes and miners' strikes. Now, I want to talk about 2 projects that I've been involved with in various different levels, both of which I think are prime examples of what social work can and should be about. The first one I've mentioned is a community cafe. I've described in the Foxton Centre how there was a community cafe project. In a number of towns and cities, there are similar community cafe projects. The problem is that Mandy, who's here, is a qualified social worker. So does that make her community cafe a social work project? But in other places, in Liverpool and Manchester, when there are community cafe projects, there is not a social worker in sight. Does that mean that they're not social work projects because there's no social worker involved? So it's a question. Then there was the miners' strike. This was a long time ago, ancient history now, in 1984 and 1985. And during the year-long miners' strike, whatever else was happening, there was deep trauma in many of the mining towns and villages. Many of them, especially in the Yorkshire coalfield, were almost under occupation from the police as people were stopped from moving around the country. And many of the women in the pit villages had to describe or had to decide what they were going to do. There were some very immediate needs for their communities and their families. So they put on collective kitchens organised by Women Against Pit Closures. They fed the community every lunchtime. It was cheaper to do this collectively, but it also meant that people weren't isolated in their homes and every day would come together to share experiences and talk about things. But then they discovered that still trauma was there. People were struggling with how to cope with a year-long strike. So we got to Christmas and they put on a pantomime. I don't want to be too political, but you can probably guess who the Wicked Witch was in 1984 during the miners' strike. But at several places, they put on community pantomime, which tried to explain their trauma as a community as they were going through a year-long strike. And then in some of the places, they decided that even that wasn't strong enough. And so what they did on a Friday night was they put some money behind the bar and encouraged people to get drunk. Now, I'm not advocating drunkenness. I'm not here. This is not the purpose of my professorial lecture, to make sure that we all go and get drunk. But nevertheless, they were, it seems to me, trying to think in community terms about how you deal with social and community trauma at particular times of crisis. Is that not social work? Whether we think they should put the money on behind the bar, but certainly the pantomime with the other things, are these not social work? If we were to look at most social work textbooks, you would not find reference to either of these things. But it seems to me in terms of their orientation, that's exactly what they were doing. Over the last few years, I've also been privileged enough to go to the West Bank and to Lebanon, and to also engage with projects in those places. I'll talk about Palestine and the West Bank. There are 3 projects that some of my students have been to when we go back and forward. There's a disability project in the Al-Mari refugee camp, which is outside Ramallah. There's a disability project in Jenin, and there's a youth project in Balata, which is just outside Nablus. In each of those projects, there is nobody who is a qualified social worker. In each of those places, there are community-based workers who live in the refugee camps, who try to deal with the trauma of their own communities. Those projects have to be based on their histories, their experience as refugees, their isolation from their homelands, but they also have to address the very real problems that those people have. If we think about Arab cultures, there is sometimes a very conservative, with a small c, a very conservative notion of how families should be run, and also a stigmatizing account of people with disabilities. But in the Jenin Disability Project, the workers in the Jenin Project have been able to counteract medical models of disability, stigma associated with disability, and win the community in the refugee camp round to seeing that people who are disabled are victims of an unequal society just as much as those who are imprisoned because they took up guns or they were on protests against their oppression by the Israeli forces. In the Jenin refugee camp, all the homes have now got extended doorway to let people with wheelchairs in. In the centre of the project is a disability project which makes prosthetics for people who have lost arms or lost legs as a result of the occupation. And the question that immediately comes is, how can they possibly afford that? As long as I'm not being directly quoted or filmed, the reason that they managed to do this is because they write to American multinationals and say that we would like to buy a prosthetic arm. The American multinationals send it over with a bill. They then copy the prosthetic arm and send it back saying we can't afford it, thanks very much. And from then on, they have got the prosthetics within their communities. But again, there's no social worker present in these things, but are these not an example of a more popular social work, which is based on communities, which comes from community needs, and which addresses the trauma of those who are in those communities? From that starting point, I started to think about the history of social work. And if you look at the history of social work, there are a number of key textbooks. And if you look at the key textbooks of social work history, there are a number of the good and the great, and these are very important people in terms of the history of social work. But actually, if we think about social work in more broader terms, what's clear is that social work's own writing of its own history has deliberately cut out people who I think are very important social workers and who we can learn important lessons from. Let me give you just 2 from British history, who you have probably heard of, but who do not appear in any social work history textbook. The first one's Sylvia Pankhurst. You'll know Sylvia Pankhurst as a suffragette. You'll know that Sylvia Pankhurst in 1914 split with her mum and her sisters. They supported the First World War. Sylvia Pankhurst refused to. Sylvia Pankhurst moved to the East End of London in 1914, and when she was in the East End of London in 1914, she started to work with the community in that part of the world. What did she do? Well, she advocated for them. At the time when women were pulled in front of the poor law guardians, perhaps because their husbands had gone to fight in France, perhaps because their husbands had been killed or injured in France, and there was no money coming into the home, and families were struggling to make ends meet. They were called in front of the poor law guardians if they wanted to get any money. They were nervous, working-class women who had to go and face their betters in that arena. And Sylvia Pankhurst used to go with them. She would go with them, she would represent them, and she would advocate for them. Today, social work makes a great claim of advocacy skills. We claim this is something new. This is something that Sylvia Pankhurst was doing in 1914 and 1915, and yet Sylvia Pankhurst does not appear in any history of social work. In the winter of 1916, the hungry winter of 1916, in the East End of London, starvation was rife. Sylvia Pankhurst's response was to set up a community cafe with high-quality, nutritious food for the women and children in the East End who couldn't afford to feed themselves. And then as she did that, she realised that many of those young children would not have a Christmas. And so she set up a factory that employed their mothers to build toys which they would get a wage for, which they could then spend the wages on buying a toy so that each of those children would have at least one present that Christmas. Again, seems to me community models of social work and yet not included in our history, and therefore the question is, why not? My suspicion is that Sylvia Pankhurst ruined her record by joining the Communist Party in 1919, but I'm not sure that that's for certain. But Sylvia Pankhurst was one. A second one is a man called Clem Attlee. Clem Attlee we all know. Clem Attlee was the Prime Minister in 1945 who set up the welfare state. But yet in 1912, Clem Attlee wrote a book, about social work, one chapter of which is called The Social Worker as Agitator. It's an interesting phrase, the social worker as agitator. The role of the social work is to agitate on behalf of the poor, of the marginalised and the oppressed. And yet when we look at our social work history books, Clem Attlee is claimed as the architect of the welfare state, but not as a social worker himself. And then we can think of some other people. You may not know these names, but in America, Jane Addams and Bertha Kaplan Reynolds followed a similar trajectory. One of the things I'm very proud of Hope University Library is that we now have a collection of the works of Jane Addams and Bertha Kaplan Reynolds, the only collection of its kind in Britain, which talks about a more radical American tradition of social work practice, and it's there in our library. Mena Mosa, you almost certainly have never heard of Mena Mosa. But Mena Mosa came from a very affluent family in Switzerland. She came and trained as a social worker at Cambridge University. She went and worked in the settlements in London. In 1903, she went back to Switzerland and set up the first school of social work in Switzerland. So clearly she was a social worker. The Swiss thought she was a social worker. She must be in the history books. She's not even in the Swiss history books. The reason for that, I think, is because in the 1930s she was involved with an organisation called the Red International, which was linked with, which was an organisation set up to support refugees from the Spanish Civil War, and she was associated with the Communist Party in the same way that Jane Addams and Bertha Kaplan Reynolds were at a time when the Communist Party was associated with a wide range of progressive movements, and she's been written out of history for those reasons. So as we go back, there are symbols, there are people who have a different history, but a history which is very important, it seems to me, to what a new social work can all be about. And the final example I just want to give of something similar is what happened in Spain from 36 to 39, because we don't really talk about Spain and the Spanish Civil War. But there was 3 organisations that were involved at that time, and again, each of them has a different type of social work, it seems to me. One of them was an organisation called the Mujer Libre. It was an organisation of women that set up cafes, nurseries and various different social welfare organisations to liberate women in the Republican side of Spain, partly, it needs to be said, so that many of those young women could go and fight at the front, but therefore knowing that their families and their children would be looked after. The second one was that the Spanish Republican regime had to set up children's homes because many of the children's homes in the 1930s were run by the church, and many of them had left to go to the Francoist side, so they had to quickly do that. And as they did that, they set those things up with the support of American social workers. Social workers in America for the Democratic Spain, they were called. But there was also something called the Children's Colonies, which will probably have been written out. And there's a charity in Britain today called The Plan, which you can Google and you can go onto their website. And it's a very mainstream organisation of social work. What it does is it supports children in war situations. But its roots come from Spain in 1936 and 1937, when they organised to look after the orphans from Madrid and Barcelona as the Civil War was raging. And as the Civil War finished, they marched those children up over the Basques and into France to protect them from what was happening before. Now, we may disagree with elements of the politics of some of these organisations, but the point I'm making is that all of these were very important social work projects, and yet social work today in Britain and social work internationally does not recognise these as social work. They have been written out of our history, and one of the things that we would like to do at Hope is to re-establish that history, to rediscover that history, to look back at those and think about those from a perspective of today in terms of what can we learn from those projects to bring to a modern world today. And just to make the point that these are not only historical examples, if you want to go away and Google this later on, go and Google in Occupy Sandy. You'll all have heard of the Occupy movement that was established a couple of years ago, which was talking about global debt and inequality and how we can address those things. But in America, in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, the people that were involved established themselves as a social welfare organisation in New York to address the problems of people who had been affected by the hurricane. And you can Google Occupy Sandy and you can go to their website and you can look at what they did, and what they've got is a banner which says mutual aid, not charity. And it seems to me an important way of thinking about intervention at those times. So it seems to me, just to start to draw these things together, it seems to me that we can think about social work in two planes. On the one hand, there is the vertical plane of social work, of state-directed social work, which of course is not a uniform body which is divided amongst itself. Today within social work, you can find some people who continue to pathologise service users. They are a minority, but you can continue to find people who think that way and who hark back to traditions of 19th century intervention. You can also find people who are radical social workers today. Again, a minority, but they see themselves as having an orientation on community and community development. And you have the vast majority of state-directed social workers who believe that reform to the system and reform of the individual can play an important part in helping people address their traumas and address their problems. And for me, that works across the vertical plane. But I think there's also, the horizontal plane, but I also think there's a vertical plane. And the vertical plane is what I would call popular social work. And that refers to all those activities which we should embrace as social work, which are sometimes undertaken by social workers and sometimes by good community activists. It goes back to the friendly movements. It goes back to the trade union movements of the 19th centuries. It has strong links with social movement activities. It's not uniform. It's contested in the same way that state-directed social work is contested. But it has within it a series of claims that it's non-stigmatising. It doesn't work with distinctions between the deserving and the undeserving poor. It supports people whenever they are in need. It's based on mutual aid. It's non-hierarchical because the people that work within them tend to be from the communities within which they live and they exist. The example, I think, from Liverpool locally would be Sheila's here from the Communiversity, but the Communiversity would be a fantastic example of what that's like from close by in Liverpool. And it's based on notions of solidarity and mutual support. And it seems to me that within that notion of a popular social work, we can start to get a glimpse, and it's no more than a glimpse, of a different type of social work, of another social work, of a social work which doesn't have to be hemmed in by state regulation, but can actually address the community needs and the community trauma that many communities and many individuals face. And that's my one PowerPoint that looks at in terms of, this is the only thing I can do on PCs. It's the only thing I can ever get away with. But that, to me, would be how I would visualise it. Some people who are engaged in popular social worker projects will be social workers, and some won't. But social work as a whole will be deeply enriched if it engages with such projects, if it's willing to learn from such projects, and it embraces some projects. We have much to learn, but if we cut ourselves off from such projects, we will lose a richness and variety about what social work and what good social work can be. And that's the kind of things that I hope that at Liverpool Hope, and with colleagues in Durham like Vasilis and people like John from the past, hope here that we can start to work together to research and research the history of a more popular social work and look at what that can do to enhance and develop our modern social work today. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure as Dean of Sciences and Social Sciences to thank you, Professor Lavalette, for your informative, challenging and engaging presentation. I'm also delighted to see John and Wendy Bates here tonight amongst your guests, recognising the role they played in establishing the department, which, as the Vice-Chancellor has mentioned, has quickly become one of the jewels in the faculty's crown. Your talk this evening has highlighted for many of us the numerous issues that surround social work and its implementation in the 21st century. We have, of course, in this region, Bootle, the place with the shortest expected lifespan in the country. Hence, we are ideally placed, unfortunately, for work placements of the highest quality. However, as a society, we pay care workers a minimum wage. Clearly, we do not value this profession highly. We need to equip our own students, our future social workers, with the training required to help our fellow human beings to cope with the pressures of living with our societal requirements. It was not always so, and indeed in some parts of the world it's still not so. Some communities look after their own. We've increasingly abandoned ours. The industrial age, the beginning in Professor Lavalette's vertical plane, initiated changes that brought together people into alien factory environments. These factory conditions were grim. They relied on mines and miners for energy. A population that was unregimented had to quickly adapt to working hours and in conditions that did not exist. 300 years ago, our population lived in communities. The job at the start of the Industrial Revolution became more of a focal point, and home less so. An early piece of social work research was centred on Patience Kershaw, a young woman, and I deliberately picked out a woman because, as you'll have seen from Professor Lavalette's talk this evening, most of the people mentioned were women, and as a society we owe a debt. But Patience was a young woman at the height of the Industrial Revolution. And Patience Kershaw can be Googled, and you can actually find the transcript. And her interview, which was an early example of qualitative research, and her testimony are available today. She spoke of life working in a mine. So let me tell you her story. Her job was to push the wagon into the mine. The miners would fill up the wagon with coal, and she would push it out. In our modern industrial speak, her unique selling point was that she was cheaper than a donkey. She couldn't have a day off work because she couldn't feed herself if she did. If she happened to be ill at a particular time of the month or she wasn't feeling too well, she still had to go to work. She would be beaten up by the miners if she was slow. In her testimony, she doesn't blame the miners at all. She simply says, "Well, sir, their families will starve if I am slow." She understands. Her big regret as a young girl is that when she has to pull and push this barrow, going back out of the mine, she'll put her head on it and push. And this is all in the testimony. So as a young woman, she's going bald. She's developing muscles that make her look more like a man. And her one cry to God is that, "I wish I was a boy." These were the conditions that existed then. For her, there was no escape. That was her condition in life. There was no escape. Let's move on to March 2013 and return to Boozle. Last Sunday, my wife and I went to help a young family in Boozle. They're an average family. They have 2 young children. The house is a terraced 2 up and 2 down building with a backyard, and their front looks out directly to a brick wall beyond which is the gasworks. And depending on the time of day, depends how much of the gas cylinder they can see. They're walking distance to the shopping centre in which Jamie Bulger was taken. Another case that's desperate for social work. The woman works full-time for approximately £50 a week. The £50 is there as the difference between childcare, the payments that she makes towards childcare, and the money that she brings in. They can't afford for her to stop. The £50 a week is the difference between them having food and not having food. The young boy cannot speak but grunts. Some people have seen in the papers 3 weeks ago that some schools in Boozle are experiences, it's not just Boozle, but Boozle is a prime example, experiencing children coming into the school at 5 years old who can't speak. And a first step is to turn the grunts into speech that can be recognised. An increasingly common problem. Their diet, as it is cheap and sugar-based. Both parents smoke. They claim that's their only pleasure. Both parents are overweight. They both work. This is not an unemployed family. They've worked all their lives in unskilled jobs. And this particular week, they had no money for food. And nowhere to go without the likelihood of their children being taken away from them. I can't see how they can escape their fate. This is a situation which our social work students have to face and which our team must prepare them for. It's not an easy undertaking. My colleague Dave Merriweather, knowing I was doing this talk tonight, pointed out to me in this morning's paper that we have in our common rooms, so The Independent, half of UK children will live below breadline in 2015. Take a walk through Boozle, take a walk through the East End of London. This is not a cheap headline. Professor Lavalette's talk has graphically pointed to causes and fundamental changes, even in our understanding of social work. And he's gone back to look at what social work should be. As a society, we must make these changes if we are to avoid the high financial and personal costs associated with coping in our current society. I'm proud to verify that our social work team, of which Professor Lavalette sets a clear and identifiable social justice direction, recognised nationally and increasingly internationally, is a positive agent of change. Our students leave hope with a very clear idea of our faculty mission statement: to produce graduates who positively contribute to society. We at this university can evidence initiatives in some of the cutting-edge research we undertake which impacts on society. And I'm proud to say that there's clear evidence of this in our faculty this evening. It was St. Thomas Aquinas who said that the things we love tell us what we are. Professor Lavalette loves humanity and works to make this a better place for all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Dr. Brinkman, for that salutary response to what was a passionate lecture from Professor Lavalette. Professor Lavalette's chair is named Professor of Social Work and Social Policy, and I think the intention in linking those two together is that the kind of academic exercise that takes place at the university must spill over and influence social policy. And if the university is not a critical voice in the development of policy, then I think as a university we have failed. Last week we had the 5-year review of this department, and on the review are always external professors that we appoint, and one of them was from the oldest department of social work in the country, which is Birmingham. And she's a very established professor, and I was one of the people that the committee interviewed. And she stayed behind after the panel left my office. And she said to me some wonderful things about the campus, which she's discovered, and she called it a jewel that she's discovered, and enjoyed our beautiful campus. But she stayed behind to tell me just what she thought about this department. She said it's one of the most dynamic departments already in the country. And that was music to my ears, of course. But departments are made up of people, and you can see why this department under Professor Lavalette's leadership is gaining recognition nationally and abroad. One of the things that Professor Lavalette has brought to my attention is that the settlement movement that made such an impact in the 19th century actually began in Liverpool, and it's fallen into disuse in the city. And a couple of years ago, he brought to my attention his wish to re-establish the settlement here in Liverpool. It was a grand vision, and I've grown to understand it, and now this university is committed to make Professor Lavalette's vision a reality. The settlement movement is to find a place in the poorest part of town, as the Dean urges us, and to place our students in the poorest part of town to make sense of their academic reflection in the context of the human predicament and real need in the city. And we'd like to show the way in re-establishing what began in Liverpool, to bring it back to Liverpool. And I'm happy to announce that, in fact, we've made some major strides in taking that forward in the next few months. But may I also say that one of the great joys of this department, and of course with my colleague, Professor Lavalette, is the ability to have a colleague that is so supportive. And it's not often I have a chance to say this, I don't embarrass him, but even in departmental meetings, when I meet with heads of departments and we talk about the academic futures of the university, I have in him a critical voice, but a supportive and creative colleague. and it's a great joy to work with you, Michael. So congratulations on taking on this chair, being the foundation professor. I wish you and your department every success. It's our custom to give you a token at this time, so if you would come forward and take a little gift from us. It sort of records the title of your lecture, and hopefully it'll be a little reminder of this evening. Congratulations. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a great joy to have you at the university. Good night.